Joe. All right, we will call the meeting to order. Good morning, everyone. And we will start. The agenda is on the screen for today. Do any committee members have changes to the agenda? And seeing none, then the agenda is approved. And we'll move to our next item, which is approval of the September 4th committee meeting minutes. Joe's pulling those up. And if there are no questions on the meeting minutes, I would entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Thank you. Who was
Second.
that? Okay.
Who are
Joe,
both
do
of
you need
those?
I have to. Yeah, food number.
Brian was the second.
Okay. Did you get that, Joe?
I got the second. I didn't get the motion.
Oh, Patrick Boylan. Motion.
Thank you. So we have a first and a second. Any further discussion on the meeting minutes? All right. All in favor signify by saying aye by roll call. Joe?
Anoka County, McPherson.
Aye.
Harvard County, Robbie.
Aye.
That didn't sound like.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Beside Linden.
I think Lyndon's on vacation. Someone's standing in for him.
Who was? Can you give me your name if you're there for Carver County?
Yep, this is Whitney Schroeder. I'm standing in for Lyndon. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay. Dakota County, Laborie.
Aye.
Hennepin County, Ellos.
Aye.
Ramsey County, Isaacson.
Aye.
Scott County, Jensen.
Aye.
Washington County, Leitner.
Aye.
7W, Witter.
I'll abstain.
Tab, Kotsukos.
Aye.
MPS, Steve Peterson.
Aye.
Community Development, Boylan.
Aye.
Metro Transit, Harrington.
Aye.
MnDOT Metro, McCartney.
Aye.
MPCA, AO. Or anybody from MPCA. Mac, Reef. Suburban Transit, I know a lot of them were out, so is anybody here from Suburban Transit? MnDOT Freight, Meyer. Deed, Eddie. Bicycle, Sabota.
Aye.
Pedestrian, Turner Bargain. I heard you. One Met Council or One Met Cities is vacant. Chanhassen and Howley. I see Lauren Dickerson from MPCA. So I'm gonna go back and mark that her is here. I'm sorry, Howley. Lakeville, Omi.
Aye.
Eden Prairie, Ellis.
Abstain.
Fairleigh, Kozlucher.
Aye.
Brooklyn Park, Ruiz.
This is Mark Culver filling in for Ruiz, and I just came on, so I'll abstain because I'm not even sure what the vote's for.
It's the minutes.
Oh, for the minutes. Aye. Thank you.
Yep. Plymouth, Thompson.
1991 Upper Deck Baseball.
Michael couldn't stay on for TAC today, Joe, so
Oh.
he's not here for TAC.
Woodbury, Hartsel. Minneapolis Engineering, Hager.
Aye.
Planning, Mayell.
Aye.
St. Paul Engineering, Nick Peterson.
Aye.
And planning, Ruben Collins, I believe you're the member. Or
Ruben
anybody?
was absent.
All right, okay. Anybody else from St. Paul Planning? Okay. Chair, the ayes have it with a pretty easy form.
Great, thank you. So the meeting minutes are approved. And we will move on. The agenda, is there anyone from the public here to address the committee today? Seeing none, then we'll move to the tab report. Go ahead, Elaine.
Thank you, Chair. TAB met on September 18th. For the Chair's report, Chair Hovland reported that the Regional Solicitation Policymaker Work Group had met right prior to the TAB meeting. Discussion was on how to accomplish the most for the region and what to bring to the full TAB to discuss as an approach. TAB has been using the modality approach in the last several cycles, and should we be thinking more about an outcome-based approach? The underlying question is, how can we best accomplish the most for the region through the regional solicitation process that aligns with the 2050 TPP? For MnDOT report, County CGM reported that construction is beginning to tone down. They are expecting a snowy season, so they will not be able to continue construction late in the year like they did last year. And there was a significant increase in fatalities in the previous month. In August, there were 271 fatalities reported, and by September TAB meeting, there were 320. And this is across the state, and this compares to 280 at the same time last year. For MPCA, Frank Kolash reported that MPCA is in the process of working out the details of the $200 million climate action grants that Minnesota was awarded under the Inflation Reduction Act. They also have grants open right now for the Volkswagen settlement for heavy-duty vehicles, and this grant is available on their website. And they also have a grant opportunity for reducing emissions of trail engines. There was no MAC report. The Met-Council report, Deb Barber reported on Network Now. Network Now is Metro Transit's plan to design transit service that best meets the needs of the region, grows transit ridership, and expands access to jobs. For the Suburban Transit Association, Gary Hansen reported that Maple Grove, Minnesota Valley, Southwest all had record service provided for the state fair. Plymouth Metrolink ridership is up 20% on regular routes, and their on-demand is up 36%. And Plymouth Metrolink will coordinate with Maple Grove Transit on a Northwest service study for the 2025 service. For the business items, TAB approved the Unified Planning Work Program for 2025. They approved the scope change request for Southwest Transit's Mall of America service. This one came through TAC. It adjusted the service, removing the Golden Triangle and adding the airport. And then they also discussed the scope change policy. TAB had some concerns for the amount of funding that would be allowed to be removed from a project without coming for TAB for action. And this is in regards to the part of the policy where an element of a project was being completed by another project. So it was being removed from the regional solicitation project. And the TAC had recommended up to 10% on a total project cost for larger projects over 1 million and 20% for under 1 million. TAB members had concern that for a large total project cost, this would be a significant amount. So they passed a motion to return the item back to TAC for further input to discuss those percentages and also discuss an option for maybe considering a dollar value as a cap for the project amount being kept. And then for information items, they had regional solicitation evaluation update, update from the policymaker work group. The work is to figure out how we want to fund projects and implement goals, objectives, and policies of the 2050 TPP. And I want to get alignment with the 5 TPP goals: equitable and inclusive, healthy and safe, dynamic and resilient, climate change, and protect and restore natural systems. And then Glenn Johnson reported on the active transportation work group. That work group has discussed policy level grant management, considerations for the pilot. Staff reviewed and discussed the grant management requirements for similar programs. So far they've determined they need to need some policy direction on program year, grant disbursements, eligible project costs, project plan documentation, environmental impact review, right-of-way acquisition process, scope change process, and in DBE enterprises. And an action item will be brought back to the October 16th TAB meeting to adopt requirements for implementing the active transportation projects. And then following this discussion, the work group will then turn their focus to the 2026 regional solicitation. And then Joe and Jenny both presented an item on the program year policy update as an info item. TAB discussed what we would like the committees to consider. TAB supports one-time one-year requests for extensions, but they also support having exceptions with the project sponsor making the case for the exception. Applicants must show reasonable progress on the project. TAB would like to see limit on the number of requests for exceptions, and they also asked the committee to consider allowing other exceptions for other hardships, in addition to projects that are requesting an exception because they are tied to another large project that is shifting. And then TAB requested that the action transmittals include a full description of all program year extensions previously approved for the project. So if one's coming in for multiple exceptions, then they want the previous exceptions detailed in the description. And then there was an information item on local forecast to the 2050 by Todd Graham of Research.
Thank you, Elaine. Are there any questions for Elaine on the TAB report? Okay, seeing none, then we will move on to committee reports. So before we get to the two action items from Executive Committee, Executive Committee did meet this morning and talked about both the program year policy and the scope change policy. So as Elaine noted, TAB has sent the scope change policy back to TAC. And if you were here last month, then you'll remember that TAC had already sent the program year policy back to F&P. And so TAC exec this morning decided that both policies need to go back to the working group for additional work and recommendations, and then send those recommendations back up through funding and programming to TAC and then back to TAB per our typical process. So if you are a working group member, I thank you in advance for your continued work on these policies, which I know is an additional time commitment for you all. We're hoping that we can bring these policies together and do that work together in a small group and hopefully be very respectful of everyone's time and minimize that additional time commitment for you. The idea was that the updated policies could be sent out with the award letters that are coming for the most recent regional solicitation. That's not going to happen, but those letters are coming out in the next couple of days here, and we will, my council staff will get those updated policies out to project sponsors once that work is complete. And then just another quick note for you all, if you're thinking ahead, November is typically the month where we have our members caucus within their kind of groupings of city, county, and agency members, because every other year, because my term as TAC chair will be up at the end of this year and a new TAC chair does need to be nominated. So if we follow our typical informal rotation, the TAC chair will move to a county rep next year. So that's a heads up to you county members. And so we will plan to have those caucus conversations in November. I think last time Joe set up separate Teams rooms so that folks could go in and have those conversations and then hopefully come back with a recommendation. And then that new TAC chair will need to nominate a vice chair as well as new chairs for funding and programming and the planning subcommittee. Any questions on those two items out of TAC exec today? Okay, then we will move to the first streamlined tip amendment item, which is 2024-43, and Robbie is going to walk us through that. Go ahead, Robbie.
Thank you, Chair and members. Good morning. So we have two sets of streamlined tip amendments this morning. This is 2024-43. I'm not going to read this off verbatim, but we'll talk about the three new projects that are looking to be added in District 3. So MnDOT is looking to add a new project to construct storm sewer improvements along the North Fork Crow River. It's outlined there. And they're also looking to add a new project to construct roundabouts and ramp heads at Interstate 94 and Wright County Road 137, and add a new project to replace an old bridge with a new bridge over Wright County Road 19. We include a map for the two bridge improvements along 94 there. The North Fork Crow River borders St. Michael and Rogers. I'm happy to answer any questions about these projects. Otherwise, I will list out the recommended motion here for your consideration. That the Technical Advisory Committee recommend that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend approval of the following 2025-2028 Transportation Improvement Program amendments that I just listed. And I will stand for your questions.
Any questions for Robbie or anyone who would like to move this item?
Madam Chair, this is Joe with Anoka County. I'll make a motion to move these.
Thank you, Joe. Is there a second?
Robert Ellis will second.
Thank you, Robert. So we have a first and a second. Any further discussion on this item?
Chair, I'm sorry, I can't find how to raise my hand when I'm sharing my screen here. I'll just add that between this item and the next item, a lot of these are sort of pent up demand during the development of the tip, and some things that maybe in these three projects that MnDOT District 3 would love to have changed several months ago, but the timing of the tip doesn't really allow for that. So that's why in October we usually see a lot of tip amendments like this. So that's why there's 3 here, and then I think there's 6 or 7 in the next item.
Okay, that's
So,
good information.
I
Thanks, Joe.
apologize while I was saying that I caught that Mr. McPherson made the motion, but who made the second?
Robert.
Robert Ellis. Thank you.
Ellis.
Sorry.
Yep. Okay, any further discussion on this item? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Joe?
Anoka County McPherson.
Aye.
Harvard County Schroeder.
Aye.
Dakota County Laborie.
Aye.
Hennepin County Ellis.
Aye.
Ramsey County Isaacson.
Aye.
Scott County Jensen.
Aye.
Washington County Leitner.
Aye.
7W Witter.
Aye.
Tab Coordinator Katsukos.
Aye.
Met Council MTS Peterson Steve.
Aye.
Community Development Boylan.
Aye.
Metro Transit Harrington.
Aye.
MnDOT Metro McCartney.
Aye.
MPCA Dickerson.
And aye.
Mac Reef.
Aye.
Suburban Transit I don't think was here. Meyer was not here. Eddie was not here. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Bicycle Sabota.
Aye.
Bargain was not here. Howley was not here, I don't believe.
I
Oh,
am
her-
here. This is Mackenzie.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Are you?
And aye. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Howley, I don't believe was here. Omi,
Aye.
like Phil. Eden Prairie Ellis.
Aye.
Howley just chimed in with an aye. Gotcha. Because Lucier Fridley. Brooklyn Park Ruiz. Or was it?
Culver for Ruiz, aye.
Sorry, I forgot to change that. Gotcha. Thompson's not here. Chris Hartzell Woodbury.
Aye.
Minneapolis Engineering Hager.
Aye.
Minneapolis Planning Mail.
Aye.
St. Paul Engineering Nick Peterson.
Aye.
And I believe St. Paul Planning was absent. The ayes have it.
Excellent. That item carries forward. 2024-44 then, Robbie.
Thank you, Chair and members. So this is the second set This is 7 MnDOT Metro District project adjustments. It's a streamlined tip amendment request. This is Anoka County and MnDOT are requesting an amendment to the 2025-2028 Transportation Improvement Program for these 7 projects. So the first project is adding local funding and changing the scope of an Anoka County project to construct a mini roundabout on CASA 6 and roughly between 5th and 7th Street in Fridley. And the next is a cost decrease for a mill and overlay project on Minnesota 20 from River Road in Cannon Falls to 280th Street at the Goodhue and Dakota County line in Cannon Falls Township. The next is a scope change to add pavement reconstruction on 2 bridges to a project repairing, painting, and reconstructing the superstructures on 13 total bridges on Interstate 94 and Interstate 35E in St. Paul. We have a map for this one. It's a lot of different bridges, but you have a handy map there to identify the bridges included in this. The next is a cost decrease for a mill and overlay on Minnesota 316 from US 61 in Welch Township to Tuttle in Hastings, and a construction of turn lanes on that same corridor at various locations in Ravenna Township. Another handy map there for you. And the next is a cost increase for a bridge repair project on Interstate 94, the Hudson Bridge over the St. Croix River in Lakeland and Hudson. So that's kind of the Minnesota portion of that span. And to add a new project to replace a rail bridge over Interstate 494 in Bloomington, 0.8 miles east of the junction of Interstates 494 and 35W. So this is a rail bridge over Interstate 494 as identified on that map there with that blue line. And the final is adding a streamlining study of the Grand Round Park and Parkway system in St. Paul. So this is a consultant study agreement. So the recommended motion in front of you is that the Technical Advisory Committee recommend that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend approval of the following 2025-2028 Transportation Improvement Program amendments as I just listed. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Robbie. Joe, I'm guessing this is the same situation with pent-up demand while the TIP was being developed?
Correct.
Okay, great. Any questions on this item or anyone who would like to move it forward?
I'll make a motion to move.
Thank you, Molly. Who was the second?
Jim Kislucher with Fridley.
Thank you, Jim. All right, we have a first and a second. Any further discussion on this item? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Joe?
Joe, you're muted.
Only been 5 years. I'm gonna figure this out. McPherson.
Aye.
Schroeder.
Aye.
Lavery.
Aye.
Ellos.
Aye.
Isaacson.
Aye.
Jensen.
Aye.
Leitner.
Aye.
Where were you here? I don't remember.
Yes, aye.
Thank you. Kotsukos.
Aye.
Steve Peterson. Steve Peterson. Yeah, we don't need your vote. Boylan.
Aye.
Harrington.
Aye.
Hartney.
Aye.
Dickerson.
Aye.
Reith.
Aye.
Sabota.
Aye.
Turner Bargan.
Aye.
Howley.
Aye.
Homey.
Aye.
Ellis.
Aye.
Lucher.
Aye.
Culver.
Aye.
Hartzell.
Aye.
Hartzell. Hager.
Aye.
Mayel.
Aye.
Nick Peterson.
Aye.
The ayes have it.
Great, that item carries forward. And that completes the items out of the executive committee. Planning committee, Gina, is there anything that you would like to report on?
No, Chair Hager, we did not meet this month and we're waiting to hear if we will meet. Sorry, we didn't meet last month and we're waiting to hear if we'll meet in October.
Okay, great, thank you. Any questions for Gina on the planning subcommittee?
Chair
Seeing none.
Hager, can you mark me down for an aye on that last vote here? I think I froze for a moment. Steve Peterson.
Sure thing.
I was frozen like this? Maybe, I don't know.
All right, and then Michael is not here. Funding and programming also did not meet last month, so nothing to report there other than the items we already discussed regarding the program year and scope change policy work that needs to occur. So we did coordinate with him on that work as well. So that concludes the action items for today, and we will move into our information items, starting with the presentation on the Minnesota greenhouse gas reduction legislation and target setting by Chris Berrens and Anna Pierce. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Chair Hager, maybe just as a preview for these two information items, members who are on funding and programming and TAC planning that are not on TAC, we did invite to be part of these since they're not going to the subcommittees, but important topics. So if it's okay with you, if they do have questions, those members, since this is an information item, want them to be part of the discussion.
Absolutely. Sounds great.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Anna Pierce here. She is going to be covering kind of where we're at with this effort to evaluate the emissions in the transportation sector, understand where we can reduce emissions, and how that differs in different parts of the state. So if Anna's here.
Hi, thank you, Chair, and everyone for having us today. Feel free at any point to jump in and ask questions, raise your hand, and I'd ask Chris or maybe Joe, if someone has their hand raised or a question in the chat, if you could just unmute and let me know, that would be awesome. I'm not used to WebEx, so there's some finagling here, so apologies if there's some delay there. But as Chris Berrens mentioned, my name is Anna Pierce. I am in our Office of Sustainability and Public Health at MnDOT, and I'm our Carbon Reduction Program Coordinator. But I was also tasked to help out with the Minnesota greenhouse gas reduction legislation, specifically that target setting portion of the legislation. So today we just wanted to cover some details and make sure everyone is kind of on the same page about what happened with the law in 2023 and 2024. We want to share what our current approach is to meeting the state statute requirements in regards to the target setting portion of the law. And then we want, oh my goodness, this happened another time. We would like to document any questions and any input you all have, and then kind of our next steps moving forward. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page here, we have some things that I wanted to clarify with you all. I don't know why it keeps moving on its own. When we talk about greenhouse gas reduction, sometimes we also talk about carbon dioxide reduction. Really, greenhouse gas is a more encompassing terminology. It encompasses carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then fluorinated gases as well. But carbon dioxide makes up about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So in transportation, a lot of times we use carbon reduction generally as the term because that's the majority of our emissions come from carbon dioxide, and we generally have more control over carbon dioxide emissions as those are mostly what we see for tailpipe emissions. So in Minnesota, just as a reminder, I don't know why that keeps happening. We break down our greenhouse gas emissions by sector when we're reporting them. So we have electricity generation, agricultural and forestry and land use, industrial, commercial, residential, waste, and then transportation. And as of 2020, transportation made up 27% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota. We're the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have a lot of work to do to help get us to net zero per our state statute. When we talk about transportation emissions, we also generally break it up into surface transportation, which is 22% of all emissions in Minnesota. And then we have other transportation. That other transportation is rail, aviation, waterways, and natural gas pipelines. So we are having specific conversations with those folks about how that will contribute to the emissions reductions as well. But we want to really focus on surface transportation because we have a pretty significant sphere of influence on that. When we talk about surface transportation, it is light duty vehicles, so single occupancy vehicles, cars, light duty trucks, things like that, make up about 67% of that. And then we have heavy duty vehicles like your semis, tractor trailers, air conditioned vehicles, which are more those refrigerator truck vehicles. And then we have that other category of buses, motorcycles, RVs, and that sort. Things we always want to make sure we're reminding ourselves is like, why do we want to reduce emissions? Well, there's a lot of negative impacts. There's poor air quality, increase of climate change, negative impacts to our wildlife habitats and crop cycles, and then also negative health impacts such as asthma and increased cardiovascular disease. But when we start to reduce emissions, we see improvements in people's health, their safe access, equity, and then also the environment around us. So as some legislative background here of kind of why we're here. In 23 and 24, the Minnesota State Legislature basically updated state law to include three main components to reduce emissions. We are tasked at MnDOT to set targets that bridge this gap between where our current emission levels are and where they're projected to be, and our Next Generation Energy Act targets. And we'll talk about those in a second. That's what we're going to focus on today. Then the second part of the legislation is that we are to develop a transportation greenhouse gas emissions impact assessment, and Chris Berrens will be coming back to you all with more details on that in the future, but we're not going to focus on that part today. So if you have questions about that, I encourage you to reach out to Chris about the impact assessment. And then the third part was that we were to establish a technical advisory committee specifically that will guide and help us through the development of that transportation impact assessment. And that group has just started meeting in September. And Chris, if you want to drop in the chat to the membership, and we have a website specifically for that group. So I mentioned today we are going to focus mostly on this setting targets portion. So this is the legislation, but really wanted to highlight that the legislation is having us get to these in this green box here on the screen, the Next Generation Energy Act targets. So we have from 2005 GHG emissions levels, we need to reduce by 30% by 2025, 50% by 2030, oh dear, and to net zero by 2050. The law is asking us to figure out how we get to narrow down this gap. Specifically, we at MnDOT are tasked with establishing greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for just our transportation sector, as we are the largest contributor to emissions in Minnesota. So 3 main parts here. The first one is really important to you all, as we must provide an allocation to the metropolitan area, which is defined in statute as basically the 7-county metropolitan council area. So we have to set a target for there, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. We must also account for any differences in the feasibility and extent of emissions reduction across forms of land use and across regions of the state. So basically that's saying we have to figure out what is the difference between different areas. We are using modeling to start to think through some of that, and then also a number of conversations with our partners and experts throughout the state. And then third, we may include performance targets based on our DOT districts, geographic regions, per capita calculations, or transportation mode, or any combination of those. So you'll see that as we talk through some of the approaches that we're looking at in a couple slides. Any questions so far? Just check.
Yeah,
I see Brian. Yep, go ahead, Brian.
So the statute defined the metro area as the 7-county metro area, is that right?
Correct. That's that reference there, 473-121.
And so does that mean only trips that are contained within the 7-county metro area, or is that the entire 7-county travel shed?
So we're not talking about trips, we're talking about emissions levels.
Okay, so it's only emissions that are in the geography of the 7 counties. Do you see where I'm going, Anna?
Yeah, so we're talking about the emissions for the entire state, specifically that transportation emissions, and we're determining what the emissions levels are going to, or what the sector emission levels should be for each target year. And
so I guess, and I would just advocate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I'm asking a difficult question. So, where I would go is, I would hope that we are looking at emissions, and when we're modeling things, that we're looking at the entire travel shed. And I can ask my council friends to correct me, but if I remember right, that travel shed is about 20 counties, not 7. Because I don't think that you can say that the emissions are confined to 7 counties that are associated with the metropolitan area.
Correct. Yeah, so no, I think that's a good point. I think that's something we'll note and try and figure out how to identify that and clarify some of that as we move forward.
Thanks, Anna.
Yep. Any other hands raised or questions in the chat?
I'm seeing no other hands at this time. Anyone else have a question right now? Otherwise, we'll check in again in a bit. So go ahead, Anna.
Okay, thanks, Chair. So, as we start to go through and develop these targets, I just wanted to set the stage here of like where these are coming from and what we're doing. So we start with the Next Gen Energy Act targets. Those are in those blue circles, and the line to achieve Next Gen greenhouse gas targets for the transportation sector is that light blue line. The dark blue line is our actual historic values. You can see 2020, obviously we had a significant dip with it, which I believe you all are aware of. And we are expected to receive the actual values for 2021, 2, and 3 in the next month here from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And we're expecting to see an uptick back closer to those 2019 levels. So we start with these targets for 2020, 2015, 2025, 2030, and then net zero by 2050. Then we add in the statewide multimodal transportation targets to get our 2035 and 2040 targets. And then we split the difference between 2040 and 2050 to have a 90% reduction by 2045. We do this because we need 5-year increment targets per state statute. And so that's where we get kind of these checkpoints. Then oh goodness. Then we go back and we start looking, okay, what was that baseline projection that we've seen? That's where this dashed blue line at the top is, and that's what we've typically seen. That came from the Pathways to Decarbonization report from 2019, and that really assumed that there was if we did no action, no changes to reduce emission, that's our emissions level through 2040 would remain right around 42 million metric tons of CO2. To get a better understanding and figure out kind of where we would be with our a conservative transition to electric vehicles, policy changes to reduce and prioritize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and an increased emphasis on multimodal transportation options. We have worked with MPOs and our cities and counties and tribes to get their input to our vision eval model, and that's that orange line you start to see on the screen, that dashed orange line. So the dashed orange line is more where we're anticipating our emission levels to be, and is a more accurate representation of our forecast. First, we want to acknowledge it's a great effort moving forward. We are decreasing if we continue along that trajectory as we have modeled. But there is still clearly the gap between the emissions targets for next gen and then where we're anticipating our emissions levels to be. So what the legislation has asked us to do is to figure out how we close this gap. So what regions, so where are we closing the gap? And when, as in those 5-year targets, are we able to close the gap? So you can see we start to really widen out and really end up having about, I think, let's see, about a 18 million metric ton gap between 2050 versus more like in 2035, like a 9 million metric ton gap that we need to close. So the legislation.
Anna, there is a hand raised. So Mark, do you want to do your question right now?
Sure, and apologies for my hand going in and out there. I was debating whether to ask the question or not. So I'm going to ask a potentially stupid question and hopefully not one that you've already answered in your presentation, Anna. But what does that zero goal really mean? You know, that goal in 2050, what does that really mean as far as how much greenhouse gas emissions the state is still emitting in the transportation sector? I imagine it doesn't mean like we don't have any greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, but what does that really mean?
So, and Chris, you can jump in here if I state something inaccurately. It would mean that we are back to 2005 levels. So how do I explain this? Chris, do you want to jump in and answer this one a little bit better? I feel like I'm not great at answering this clearly.
I think Mark is asking the question about like, what does it mean to, what does net zero mean? Is that right, Mark?
Yeah. I think that's a good restatement of it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the pluses and minuses accounting has you at net zero additional emissions going into the atmosphere in 2050. That doesn't necessarily mean that every vehicle on the road is not producing any carbon, but the the totality of the pluses and minuses across the entire sector is not creating any net new emissions. I think what's implied with the question there is, if you've got those pluses, where are those minuses coming from in 2050? And there is a fair amount of work going into things like carbon sequestration. I know there was a power purchase agreement with Google that was announced just a couple weeks ago that was going to be purchasing carbon sequestration at $100 a ton. And that was pretty significant because that starts to say what's that price to get to below the line. But it's I think there's a lot to still work out. I think this is one of the fundamental questions that we're being asked to wrestle with here. We have a net zero target across every sector in Minnesota, and some of the sectors, the path for getting to net zero is a little bit more straightforward. The electricity generation sector a decade ago wasn't really sure how it was going to get there, and now there's a fair amount of momentum to get to a pretty clean grid. We have a charge to get to net zero in the grid by 2040, and we're making significant strides in that sector. And now we're really being asked to understand what we can be doing that goes beyond just the people's individual choices to switch to low and zero emission vehicles, but what's within our sphere of influence as transportation decision makers.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
So yeah, essentially net zero is that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are released by human activity or like driving or things like that are releasing emissions into the air are also then removed from the atmosphere. And so that could be through mode shift, like walking or biking or other zero emission modes when we talk about transportation. It could also be talking about carbon capturing, like Chris was talking about as well.
There are a couple more questions or hands up, if that's okay right now. Adam, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is similar. I'm thinking about what does this look like? What are those carbon capture mechanisms? Because when you look at this chart, if it's 0 in 2005, that doesn't mean that there were no emissions in 2005. That axis on the side should not be 0, right? It should be whatever it was in 2005. So it's not 0. It's whatever it was then, and it'd be maybe helpful to better understand what that is, and then understanding what are those other methods. Because when I look at this chart, to me it means, yep, there's not a single transportation vehicle that emits any emissions, and that's what this chart says. But if it's go back to 2005, then that axis, I think, shouldn't be at 0. It should be at whatever it was in 2005.
I think that makes sense to me, and I think that is also posed as a question in the chat as well, if I'm just pulling that up, by Brian. And then Gina also asked if net zero is encompassing all sectors, or are we just talking about transportation here still?
So to Gina's question is that this on the chart, it's showing the emissions levels for just transportation on here, but the net zero target and all these the the 30% reduction, the 50% reduction, and then net zero by 2050. Those are the next gen targets that encompass all sectors across Minnesota. So that's in statute that we would be to net zero for all sectors by 2050.
And are all sectors then pinging to that 2005 level, that
Correct.
same year? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that is correct.
Okay. Steve Peterson, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming, both Donna and Chris here for not this meeting, but we got about 5 different committees they're coming to, so I appreciate the time. My question was on the modeling forecast, because we just did a model run for the 2050 TPP, and I wonder if that got accounted for or not. And the base year is different, you know, but it's 2022 base year going out to 2050, and our no build reduced. So from basically now to 2050, the reduction was 28%. This is just for the metro area, obviously, for the no build, and that was driven by more fuel efficient vehicles and increased adoption of electric vehicles. I'm kind of reading from the chapter, it says. But then the build scenario, which includes things like the green line extension, blue line extension, gold line, and then a couple easy pass lanes. On the flip side, the change is very small. It's like 0.19%, so 1/5 of 1% change from the no build to the build for greenhouse gases. So it's really, really tiny. But I guess I wonder if your modeling forecast built off our moves run, or if it's different modeling.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We have been working with Jonathan Ehrlich's team to make sure that things are accounted for as best as we can. It uses the vision eval model, which does incorporate moves into it as well. But I'm happy to talk through some of those details. It gets pretty nitty gritty here if we go into it too much. So I just don't want to totally get off this a little bit. But there, Joe Lehman at MnDOT has been helping us run that model, and he has said that those are very similar change numbers to what we have in some of our model as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Just a quick reminder for members that these meetings are broadcast and publicly available, so please refrain from having discussion via the chat, because we do need our public members to be able to see this and have a record of it. So I'm going to ask Patrick Boylan to please verbalize your question for the record here, and we'll refrain from using the chat for actual discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I can ask that question now if you're ready or not.
Yep. Go ahead,
my
Patrick.
question. Yeah, thank you. My question in the chat was just looking at this, just trying to understand it as completely as I can. In the chat, I had written in 2 things. One, are we looking to drop plus or minus 15 metric tons between the modeling and the next gen GHG target, or are we talking about a baseline drop of 40 plus or minus 40 metric tons between the baseline to the next gen target? And I think there's some discussion that might have been answered, but that's it. That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, and apologies for responding in the chat there. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss it. So what we're looking at here is that the purple area is the gap that's being identified. So the modeled forecast is more that anticipated where we're going to actually be. So I mentioned the baseline projection was what we used to think about if we didn't have any changes, if we didn't adopt any policies to reduce emissions, if we just continued business as usual, that's what the projected baseline would be. So we would continue to have about a 40 million metric ton gap to net zero. What we have learned through modeling and taking into account some of the things that Steve was mentioning from Met Council's modeling, as well as other MPOs throughout the state and some other modeling that has occurred, and what policies are around and accounting for that, as well as land use changes and things like that that are expected to change based on the policies that are written. And the adoption rates of EVs and things like that is more that orange dashed line of where we're projecting to be going and what emissions levels are. So it's great that we're in a downward trend, but we're still missing those targets. And that's that purple part that the state legislature has asked us to identify and break down based on region, and specifically asked us to assign Met Council a portion of that gap to close. So, and I think that's a great kind of segue into some of this other stuff that we're going to be talking about here but I know, Joe, you had a question also in the chat. So I don't want to skip Joe's question, but I think that's what we're talking about here, is that there is essentially going to be by 2050, if we don't make or accelerate some of our changes or change how we're thinking about projects and prioritizing projects to really start incorporating greenhouse gas emissions reduction more prevalently, not at the detriment to safety or equity or access, but like really prioritizing emissions reduction, we're not going to close that gap. And that's what we're kind of talking about with this.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you.
Yep. And I see in the chat, Joe Barbeau had asked or stated, because of the current / future online viewing, can these, sorry, can these be verbalized? Sorry. Thank you.
We do have another hand up, though. Go ahead, Adam.
Thanks. Do you have a number for the emissions in 2005, what that baseline was? Was it 42 million tons or was it 100 million tons? What's the 2005 number that we're measuring against?
So the 2005 levels were a little bit over 43 million tons for the transportation sector.
So it is every vehicle that operates. So this would presume that every vehicle that operates by 2050 would not emit carbon dioxide. So then the question is how do you make people do that? And that's a whole nother policy question, but I think that's a really big one for us, because we can do what we can do from the work from a transit perspective and getting people to ride transit more, but 0 is a pretty hard number.
Yeah, and I think, Adam, you're getting into some of this how part of it, that we're going to be continuing those conversations of how we achieve this after the targets are set. And some of that how gets into, yes, electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. It also gets into transportation options of increasing pedestrian and bicycle and other non-motorized or low emission transport, such as transit and things like that. And then we also get into what are our land use patterns doing and how is that affecting how people are traveling and thinking about this. But yes, it's going to be a challenging task for sure. So, and in the interest of time, Chair, do you mind if I move to the next kind of section?
Thank you. Yep.
Perfect. So how we're closing this gap, I just want to highlight the vision. MnDOT's vision is that Minnesota's multimodal transportation system maximizes the health of people, the environment, and our economy. Oh, goodness. And then our mission is to connect and serve all people through safe, equitable, and sustainable transportation system, which, like I mentioned earlier, the work that we're doing to reduce emissions is not to trade off on safety or equity or sustainability, but really enhancing those aspects of our mission to make a healthier place for people to live and work and play. So we've started talking about how we close this gap and more I'm calling it the little h and the big H. So this is kind of the big H, that overarching approach to reduce emissions. Oh my goodness. So we have two ways that we're approaching the big H. the per capita, so it strictly would be based on the number of people in a region would assign a value of emission. So if there is that gap, that purple area says that we're short by 19 million metric tons in 2050, we would divide the amount of population anticipated or forecasted in 2050 throughout the state, divide that. So let's say it's 6 million people. So we would take that 19 million metric tons, divide it by 6 million people, and then we'd have a per capita value of emissions. And then we would say in the Met Council area, say there's 4 million people. So then we would multiply that per capita amount by 4 million, and then you would have a value for the Met Council for that target year. Versus regional priorities and per capita, that approach would look more based on the ability for a region and their priorities, whether they're policy priorities or funding prioritization priorities, at how you would, as a region, look to reduce emissions. So in rural areas in Minnesota, that may be through low or no emission vehicles, and making that shift is an theoretically easier way that they could do that. Or they might see that shift happening more in 2040 versus in 2030. Versus because of adoption rates or things like that. More urban areas may see that transit or increases to access or health may be prioritizing different types of projects that would reduce emissions, or ways, land use changes, things like that, that may be easier in a region. So we're taking that into account under this approach. Plus then per capita. So like how many people are in that region and may be able to make the shift. So those are the main two approaches, the big house. The little house are a little bit more what Adam was getting at, of like how, like what projects are we doing, more like that part of it. And that's gonna, like I mentioned, come after we set these targets. And so this is that first conversation about moving towards closing that gap. So when we're looking at these two big hows, or approaches, per capita, regional priorities, and per capita. Then we need to look at kind of regional scenarios. So we're looking at basically 3 different scenarios, and these scenarios would be the same whether we do it under the per capita or we look at regional priorities plus per capita. So scenario 1, and you'll notice all 3 of these scenarios have the Metropolitan 7-county metro area as a defined region. And that is because that is defined in statute, as I mentioned, that area needs to have a target. Now, how we break up the rest of Minnesota gets changed in each of these scenarios. So scenario 1, it would be basically you'd have 2 targets, one for the Metropolitan Council area and then one for greater Minnesota. Scenario 2 then breaks out that greater Minnesota into the other 7 urban areas in the state. The other 7 MPOs would have a population, or not population, excuse me, a emissions target, versus then the rest of rural Minnesota would be at 1 target. So that would leave us with 9 target areas or regions. And then scenario 3, what it does further is has that rural area broken up by our greater Minnesota area transportation partnerships that are more that rural planning project prioritization area. So that ultimately gives us then 16 target areas if we were to go with scenario 3. Why we're looking at doing the area transportation partnership areas and regions to set a target is because those really determine the funding priority and project prioritization in rural Minnesota. So there's more of a tie to how, that little h, with the where compared to some of the other scenarios. So we're looking at these and trying to compare what makes the most sense across these as well. I've mentioned before, this legislation is requiring us to rethink how we're prioritizing projects, and it's asking us to consider how we encourage and implement greater accountability for emissions reduction. And this is not, I've mentioned multiple times now, it's not a this or that situation. We're not trading off safety for emissions reduction. We're enhancing the work we're already doing that supports our vision and mission at MnDOT and throughout the state to have a healthier and safer transportation system. We can't do this alone. So even though MnDOT was tasked by the legislature to set these targets, oh my goodness, it is not something that we can do by ourselves. This is something we have to coordinate and work with, and we want to work with. You all in our cities, our counties, our travel nations throughout the state, our MPOs, to really figure out how we can move forward and provide more of that holistic approach to prioritize a more sustainable future. So some of the opportunities that we're seeing is to align some policy level guidance and performance measures with the reduction targets, continuing to educate our local partners about greenhouse gas emissions, reduction strategies, some of these co-benefits of safety, health, access, and equity. We're also, and that not just our local partners, but also like the public. I think Adam said it well, is that this is a shift in how people think about moving as well, and how we think about planning our land use and other things as well. We also see an opportunity to encourage our partners to submit projects to fund for funding that reduce emissions. And we can even start thinking about that as when we're selecting projects, are we putting in selection criteria that includes emissions reduction as a measure or a scoring criteria? That's something that we could potentially do to help prioritize some of these projects. So I just have kind of a couple questions here to continue the conversation of what we've already started. And I think I saw some other things being dropped in the chat as well, and maybe some questions. I know we only have a few minutes left of our time here, but some thoughts of just how would you approach supporting decisions related to the work that you're doing, like the approaches that we presented, as well as those regional scenarios. If you have any thoughts about any alignments or concerns about how we're approaching setting these targets. So with that, I think I have some notes about some next steps and other places that we're coming back to you all. We will be back in November with the proposed targets. But with that, I am happy to take any more questions that folks had. I think I saw a couple hands or things drop in the chat.
Yep, thank you, Anna. So David Berrens, could you please ask your question verbally for the record?
I think, do you want me to repeat it?
I saw that he unmuted, but I'm not hearing him. So yeah, let's, I can read this from the chat. So David is asking if the 7W area falls within the area that has been defined by statute as the metropolitan area for your work.
Yeah.
It's the urbanized portion of Sherburne and Wright counties, essentially. This is kind of an ongoing question that we have with our work here in the metro. So
yeah, no, that's a good question. So this, there's a couple of parts I want to comment on here. So that 7W part is part of the federal urbanized area boundary. In our Minnesota state statute, it's just the 7 counties. So just for the 7 counties are we required to set a target. A point of clarification I want to make is that unlike CMAQ, where we have specific emissions for an attainment area, which you don't really have much control over what happens, it like kind of this gets back to, I think Adam was maybe mentioning this earlier, but emissions, air quality, like changes, right? It doesn't stay in an area. I love to use the the visual of when someone's smoking and they walk past you, the smoke doesn't just stay where they were standing, it like continues with them. This isn't to say that the emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions are just going to be affecting the council area, but we can look at the projects and what those emissions levels are expected from the projects in that 7-county area. So it's not necessarily taking into account that how the emissions that are being brought into, but we'd be looking at like what can the projects that are in that area do to reduce emissions. I see Adam, your hand went up. So go ahead.
I had another question about emissions and how are emissions measured, since it also identifies, so there's a 7-county metro area. How do we measure emissions other than estimating what it would be? And then are there monitors in various neighborhoods that might be part of the incommensurately exposed communities? Because when we look at EPA emissions, everything looks green and it looks really good. So is there a different measure for air quality that would be measured that we could see?
Yeah, so this is what I'm trying to clarify here is it's not like CMAQ. It's not that we are looking at an attainment level or the air quality is good. It's the emissions levels that are being produced. So what we would be looking at, and I think this gets back a little bit more, and I think a good point that we need to clarify what we're using to measure these emissions for projects and programming purposes. But we would be essentially theoretically, sorry, that's a little contradictory, but looking at measuring using, let's say, our carbon emissions tool to measure or estimate what a project would be to producing emissions. And then we need to figure out, okay, is that an accurate, do some checking on what that, to confirm that those are actual emission levels. Or we could use the MICE tool to calculate what a project is expected to emit for once it's installed. More that life cycle emissions as well. So those are some of the things we would be looking to do to measure to see how the impacts, more those little hows of how that would, how the projects would actually achieve emissions reduction and get us more to that net zero output. But I think there's a lot more work there, Adam, to be done to clarify and confirm like what it is, so that we're saying, okay, are we achieving this target or not? That we can actually provide some of that information. So I think those are good points, and for sure we're writing those down.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just emphasize the point again that I think that as we think about targets and we're drawing boundaries, I think we need to be nuanced in how we think about the gradient around the metro area and the degree to which they're related. And so as we think about targets surrounding the metro area versus the metro 7 counties as defined by the statute, I think we need to, they can't be starkly different, because there's such a close correlation to the contribution that those surrounding areas have and the relationship of travel patterns to those surrounding areas. So whatever tool or whatever evaluation we're doing, I think that those can't be dramatically different.
Thanks, Brian. I think that makes a lot of sense. And Chris Berrens noted in the chat too, the MPCA, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, is the authority on sector emissions levels and reports the annual emissions. Unfortunately, the official emissions are always like a little bit of a lag from what we get. I mentioned earlier that we don't get those official emissions levels for 22 and 23 here until October. Or like later in October, it is October, is when we're anticipating having those. But Chris also dropped in the chat what that link is to their website to find that data as well on there. I saw Mark had a question he put in the chat, so I just want to make sure we got to that one as well. Mark, did you want to verbalize your question or do you
Yeah,
want me to just read it out?
Thanks, Anna. I'll just quickly read it. I'm just curious on that scenario 3, how the boundaries of the goal areas or regions actually align with MnDOT's district or boundaries.
Yeah, that's a great question. They align pretty closely. You can actually, the area transportation partnership boundaries, there's a couple that don't align necessarily the exact same. So there's, I believe between MnDOT District 2 and District 4, District 3, kind of in where they all meet. And then that northwest central part of that area of the state, there's a little discrepancy between the districts. Those districts work really well with those area transportation partnerships to make sure that programming is consistent. The reason we didn't necessarily look at the district boundaries was because the area transportation partnerships or ATPs really make that decision and approve of the local program as well and the federal and state funding of projects in those areas. So that's more of the influence that they have, whereas our districts are used to working across those boundary lines. They're a little bit different. So.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for this. I'm wondering if this is a great slide right here. Is one of the options that maybe we consider is just one target for the entire state, and it may be a little simplistic, but the how you get there is going to be different across the geographies. But I could see this turned into a finger pointing exercise, and it's all going to be pointed at the metro area, and then we're going to say, well, we're not even close to hitting the targets if it was equal across the whole state. And then so I was going to say, well, the transits in the metro area, it should all be kind of put on the shoulders of the metro area. And it's kind of like we're already a long ways from our own target, and then kind of doubling down on being further and further away from making that target. So I just wonder if that's an option to consider, is just kind of to start this out as one target across, and then how we get there is different.
Yeah, I think, Steve, that's a good point you raise. I think we've stayed away from that to help us with more of that little how and having those discussions following this, so we can start to be more specific in how we approach it. I think when we start to see and look more at the approach part of it, the per capita really starts to get more on that, like kind of the equality of having like the same target across, right? But it would just be more assigned based on the number of people in the area, versus the regional priorities that looks more at like, oh, well, you have transit, kind of that second part. Well, you have transit, so you can do more side of things. Yeah.
Well, part of this, will you have some of that data before we get to the target setting, or like how you'd get to a target?
Yeah. So what we're working through right now is basically comparing. Oh goodness gracious, this thing has a mind of its own. Is comparing these two approaches within the scenarios under each. So per capita would have then those 3 scenarios, and we'd have number values to be like, okay, what is this emissions that would be if it's per capita in greater Minnesota under scenario 1, what does that look like? Is it, a third of the total gap in each of these years, or what does that look like? Versus the regional priorities plus per capita, what would that look like under that scenario? So that's something we're working through right now, is those actual values.
Good, perfect. Yep, I think that would help the conversation tremendously. So thanks.
So that's something we will be bringing back and sharing when we come back in November to you all. Is more of that, like, here's the side by side. Okay, if we went with this, this is what this would mean. If we went with that, this is what that would mean.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair and Anna. So to Steve's point there, as we were working on the greenhouse gas vehicle miles traveled reduction working group, that exact topic came up. And when we looked at some of the other agencies across the United States, Colorado being one of them, the way they were implementing that program, and these two kind of meld together, right? Was they were assigning different quotas or targets for different parts of the state. So Steve, to that point, that is a very valid thing that we may need to look at, because in Colorado, the Denver area, the metro area was taking a bigger share than some of the rural areas for a number of reasons. But that is something we'll have to check out and see how these two things align with one another. And I know Chris Berrens is working with the TAC right now through that greenhouse gas vehicle miles traveled group that's just getting fired up. But that's a very valid point, and we'll have to see where this lines up. But I have a lot of the same fears that the metro area is going to be holding a lion's share of what this goal is. So something to look in. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe, for those comments.
All right, I'm seeing no more hands up. Last call for members.
Quick question, if I go, it's just something I wrote down in some notes very early in the presentation. Early on, it's like the third or fourth slide, there's a pie chart and then a bar chart and all sector breakdown with service, and the green was surface transportation, which is what we're talking about. Is the residential, the 7% residential, we're talking about transportation, so I'm wondering what that is. Is that what is that? Is that like people driving in things they sleep in, or I'm not sure what is that?
Okay, yeah, no, thanks for asking.
Or is it just homes emitting because of all these other categories?
So this is based on sector. So the electricity generation sector, that's literally like coal.
I got it.
Power. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm an idiot. I just got it.
No, you're
Sorry,
not.
it just clicked. I got it. Thank you. I'm done.
Absolutely. Yeah. So transportation makes up this green pie as well as this other gray transportation part. So overall, it's 27%. So I just want to clarify that for the recording and for others too. Thanks, Joe, for joining. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had today. I just wanted to flag that these are just a number of our engagement points that we're coming to. We've been engaging with folks throughout the state. We will be at the TAB executive meeting on the 16th this month, kind of providing some of this background stuff. And then we will be moving forward in November and coming back to you on the 6th to present more of that preferred and alternative approaches and like those exact numbers that Steve was alluding to and asking about. And then we'll be bringing it forward to the tab, the full tab, sorry, that's a mistype, the full tab on the 20th of November. And our commissioner will ultimately make the decision as to what this is. So, but I really wanted to say thank you so much for the discussion and thoughts today. And if you have further comments or questions, please feel free to email me at anna.m.pierce@state.mn.us. So thank you very much, Chair, and everyone for having me today.
Thank you, Anna. If you're willing, we do have one more hand up, and it's Adam. And then after that, I think we are going to try and move on in the interest of time today and get to our last information item. Go ahead, Adam.
I just have one last question. That is MnDOT on a schedule to report to the legislature? I know a lot of the legislation that was passed that the Council of Metro Transit are responsible for, there's dates that need to be reported back. Is there a regular schedule for reporting this work back to the legislature? Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Adam, thanks. I think that's a great question and something that I failed to mention. As of February 1st, 2025, we need to have these targets set. So they're a sub-allocation target, like I mentioned, so it's not the actual next-gen targets that we're moving, but we are setting this gap target amount, and those need to be set by February 1st. So that's why our commissioner, at the latest, early December, will be making the decision on what exactly to set these targets and where those targets will be for. And then we'll compile kind of how and we're not required to complete a full legislative report, but we will be compiling our engagement effort and information from you all and how we've kind of come to the conclusion on this, so that the legislature will have that if they have questions about what targets we're setting and why, and then also any future needs that we may need to request because of the targets that we set. So whether that's additional funding or incentives or other things like that. So.
Thank you very much, Anna and Chris, for coming today and for answering a lot of questions. This is clearly a very important topic and looking forward to your future updates on this. So thank you for your time today. All right, we are going to move now to Molly and Steve to give us an update on the regional solicitation and active transportation work.
Okay, I got my screen shared. I'm ready to go. So, welcome everyone. I'm Molly Stewart. I'm with SRF Consulting. I'm the project manager for the consultant team for the regional solicitation evaluation. So I just have a couple of slides to present on what we've been doing over the last almost year now. We've been working on this. And then I'll turn it over to Joe Whiting to present some slides on what the active transportation work group has been doing. So I'll go through a little bit of an overview of the evaluation, some takeaways from the investment summary we completed as part of the evaluation, and then discuss some of the feedback we received, and then kind of where we're at right now with their whole regional solicitation structure discussion that we've been having with the policymakers. So I know many of you are well versed in the regional solicitation. I just wanted to note that it's a competitive process to allocate federal funding to address the regional transportation needs. That Council has been allocating federal funding since 1993, and most recently, since 2014, it has been split between 3 modal categories, and so that's currently what we're exploring, the opportunity to either keep with those modal categories or explore another way to distribute funding. So the regional solicitation evaluation that we're currently it's currently in progress is completed every 10 years to align the solicitation with the updated TPP, so the Transportation Policy Plan. Council updates that every 10 years, so then in conjunction with that, they update the regional solicitation. The evaluation will focus on summarizing the last 10 years of funding allocation via the investment summary, which I'll touch on here in a minute. And then we'll develop recommendations for incorporation into a new funding application package for the 2026 regional solicitation. We do have a project website. I just want to point out to this group, highlighted here at the bottom of the slide, where we post agendas and summaries and media materials for the various working groups that are helping to guide our process. So overarching goal of our regional solicitation evaluation is to better align the regional solicitation with the updated TPP goals, objectives, and policies. That's what's guiding us. In addition, there are a couple of federal rules that are tied to the federal funding that Met Council distributes. I just want to note that the process must be a competitive process, and funding cannot be sub-allocated to individual jurisdictions. And then the selection process must include involvement with stakeholders and the public, including populations that are traditionally underserved and underrepresented. Our schedule for the regional solicitation evaluation, as I mentioned, we started back in the fall of 2023 and are hoping to wrap things up with a final solicitation package for releasing in 2026. So right now we're working on decision point 1, which is the identification of a preferred solicitation base structure that incorporates the 2050 TPP goals, objectives, and policies. And our goal is to have this structure identified by the end of 2024. And then in 2025, we'll be engaging with the working groups and stakeholders and policymakers to identify application categories and criteria for prioritizing projects and then scoring measures, with the goal to have a final application package by August of 2025, and then we'll send that through review and approval by TAB and its committees. And then, as I mentioned, a revised solicitation, we're anticipating having that be ready for release in early 2026. So our decision-making process is being guided by our policy maker working group, which is comprised of members of TAB and Met Council. They're the decision makers of this process and will then make recommendations to TAB and TAC and subcommittees and Metropolitan Council for review and approval. In addition, they'll take input from the Technical Steering Committee, which is members from TAC and F&P and Planning. And then as part of our plan for 2025, we're going to engage with the Special Issue Working Group. So the Active Transportation Special Issue Working Group has already been working and meeting to discuss mostly about what to do with the regional sales tax money that's been accumulating thus far. As part of 2025, we'll incorporate them more into, how do we incorporate this funding source into the 2026 and beyond solicitation. In addition, we'll develop some additional working groups that focus on different topic areas to help guide the development of criteria and prioritization of projects. A little bit more about the investment summary, and I will send a link out to Joe Barbeau after this so you can share the entire documentation with this group for review. But I do want to highlight a few things. So the purpose of our investment summary was to summarize the last 10 years of funding. This included a total project award of about $1.5 billion since 2014 through 2024 solicitation cycle. We also included a summary of major policy and technical changes in the regional solicitation process that have occurred over the last 10 years. These include the big switch from the funding program-based to a modal-based solicitation structure in 2014, and then the addition of the ABRT and spot mobility and unique project categories. So of that $1.5 billion, bicycle and pedestrian facility projects received about 19% of the funding. Transit and TDM projects received about 25% of the funding, and roadway projects, including multimodal elements, received about 55% of the funding. And then, as I noted, the unique projects category wasn't added until 2022, so it was only included in the last two solicitation cycles, but did receive those projects in that category received about $15.1 million of the total money allocated. In addition to the federal money, there was a total of about $1.6 billion that was leveraged from other sources, through, bringing the total regional investment in the last 10 years to about $3.1 billion. So this chart shows the funding allocation within each county. I will note that this includes the funding award to projects located within the county, not necessarily as the county as the applicant. So the applicants included the cities, counties, MnDOT, transit agencies, nonprofits, and other agencies that have submitted applications. So we broke this down then further to kind of highlight the total population and total jobs within each county, and how the total funding distributed by county compares to these numbers. So you can see a big takeaway here is that the total funding distribution is similar to the total jobs and population roughly by each county, with a few being slightly higher and slightly lower. And then we took that, the total funding distribution by each county, and then divided it by the total population by county to give a per capita breakdown by county, and then by modal group. So you can see that roadways are in blue, bike ped projects in red, and then the transit and TDM in green, and then gray, which I know is probably pretty challenging to see since there were so few of them, are the unique projects. The investment summary also quantifies safety benefits reported by the applicants in the past 10 years. So the total safety benefits of selected roadway projects for the 10 years of projects submitted were monetized as one measure of effectiveness for a total of about $1.6 billion anticipated in safety benefits from the 2014 through 2024 solicitation cycles. I'll also note that you can see there was a jump in 2020 when that spot mobility and safety roadway category was added to the application categories. He also had a breakdown in the investment summary that summarized the total funding awards on or impacting the MnDOT system. This equated to about $435 million of total federal funding awarded to projects that were on or impacting the MnDOT system. Approximately $400 million of that $435 million was awarded for roadway projects that included multimodal elements. Some corridors to highlight that received some of this funding include Highway 10 and 65 in Anoka County, Highway 35 in Washington County, Highway 13 in Dakota and Scott counties, Highway 169 in Scott and Hennepin counties, Highway 252 in Hennepin County, and then Highways 5 and 212 in Carver County. In the last 10 years, there's been a significant multimodal investment, including construction of about 307 miles of trails and sidewalks. This accounts for separated or ones that were constructed independently or on their own, and additional ones that were sidewalks and trails that were constructed as part of roadway projects. Some of the critical trail projects as part of these funding awards included projects such as the Bruce Bento Trail, the Capital City Bikeway, the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail, the Bryant Lake Regional Trail, and the Bassett Creek Regional Trail. There were approximately 30 projects that were included in the pedestrian improvements category, and about 29 schools that were impacted as part of the Safe Routes to School applications. So this slide summarizes the total success rate by applicant, so particularly the graphic on the top. And I will note that this is slightly updated from the materials that you guys received in your packet. This includes through 2024, so I believe in the packet it only was through 2022. So generally, you can see there's a variation in the success rate by application category of the various categories, with obviously the highest applicant success rate being realized in the Safe Routes to School and pedestrian and transit facilities, and then the lowest in the trails and multi-use trails and bike ped applicant category. So overall, the applicant success rate across all the applicant categories was about 50%. As I noted, it was probably lowest in the bike ped and pedestrian elements and the roadway applications, and highest in the transit and TDM, and then the unique projects category. Counties as an applicant had an average success rate of about 41%. That ranged from 20 to 58% amongst the 7 counties. And then cities had an average success rate of about 53%. So moving on then to, we have done a fair amount of reach out, first starting with an evaluation that was completed to reach out to some peer metropolitan planning organizations to gather data on how these organizations are distributing their federal funding. We completed a desktop review first of about 18 MPOs, and then we reached out and did some interviews, one-on-one interviews with the 6 that are highlighted here on the slide. So the information gathered through this peer review will help to guide our selection of, will guide our process as we work to identify improvements that can be made to or changes that can be made to the solicitation structure. and the elements of the solicitation structure. Some things I do want to note is from the interviews we completed, some of the themes that came out was there was an emphasis on applicants having a buy-in and ownership of the process or decisions that are being made. Many of the MPOs are shifting towards a qualitative process. And then finally, many of the solicitations are grounded in planning foundation and framework, so tying them back to their TPP goals and or their long-range transportation plans as is required of the federal funding. Finally, we did complete some listening sessions back in the early part of 2024. Many of you on this call, I think, completed or participated in those listening sessions. So we had a number of them with the cities and counties and transit agencies and state agencies, all of the applicants that submit regional solicitation applications. We're engaged. We have a summary of that document, and I just want to highlight a couple of things we heard from stakeholders. So some things we heard that should stay the same, or what people liked about the current solicitation, is that it was open and transparent. There was time for deliberation as part of the decision-making process. And then there were past projects selected provided benefit to the region. Overall, applicants felt like that was the case. They liked the data-driven process. And then there was general support for some level of modal balance for the projects that are being selected. Things that we heard that some stakeholders think should change included making the application easier and simpler. So that's one of our main focuses of ways we can improve the application process. Projects in suburban and rural areas, it was thought to didn't compete well in the bike ped category specifically. Better alignment with the regional policies and goals should be done. The current structure does not consider nuances of local government context. And there was a desire to make it easier and create more opportunities for local governments to participate. So finally, I just want to give a little update on where we're at with our structure discussions. As I noted earlier, our goal is to have a decision on what the structure of the solicitation should be by the end of this year. Currently, right now, we're focusing on to keep either the modal focus structure that currently exists. Recall that's split by the 3 modes: roadways, transit, and TDM, and bike ped, and then there's the unique project category that was added. And then we are exploring with the policymakers a goal-focused structure. So this would take the TPP goals that are identified and have them kind of guide how projects or application categories are developed then from there. So we met with the policymakers in September and discussed this. There was some additional input, and we're planning to meet with them again in November to share more information on what a goal-focused structure will look like or could look like. This November meeting will discuss examples and potentially hoping to make a decision on whether to keep with the modal focus structure or go to this goal focus structure. And then future decision points will focus on after this decision and the end of this year is made, we'll focus on details about the actual application categories, criteria, scoring measures, and then funding targets. And again, trying to get to that draft application package by August of next year. So with that, I just want to highlight a couple of next steps. So we are intending to come back again, share some more information at the TAC meeting in November. We're currently right now working on a wrap-up of another before and after study. So for this group, there's been 2 other phases completed, looking at various different metrics and trying to quantify the projects that have been awarded funding and if we're seeing the benefits that are being noted in the application. So this before and after study that we're completing now will focus specifically on safety, the safety measure, and the bike ped usage measure. We then are meeting with the policymaker working group in November and then again in December, and then with the intent to have a larger workshop for policymakers, including all of TAB and Met Council members in December. And then finally, again, trying to get to that structure-based recommendation by the end of the year so we can then send it through for TAB and committee approvals early part of next year. So I do want to note that, you know, as part of this group, the TAC, ongoing involvement will include updates and feedback opportunities throughout the process and an opportunity to be involved in those special issue working groups I noted that will start to meet in early part of next year. So with that, I did want to pause and just ask if there were any questions, and then we do have some discussion questions. I know we are kind of running short on time, so Jenny, if we want to maybe skip these, and I could ask for the email input too, but just generally trying to get at, you know, if there's some, you know, given the information I shared about the listening session feedback, anybody wanted to comment more on some of the input feed there, what types of projects you want to continue to see submitted for funding, or which projects maybe you would wish you could submit for funding that currently aren't eligible.
Okay, great. Let's start with there's one hand up with Elaine. We'll start with her and we'll see where we go from there.
Yeah, I had a question on slide 16. You want to go back to that one? I mean, noted in 2020, we added the spot mobility category, so that increased the funding for, you know, from significantly from 200 to 390. And I see in 2024, there's a reduction. And in 2024, TAB had increased the safety points across all the categories. So my question is, did you, or could you look to see whether the projects selected were the highest for the safety benefits compared to those not funded? Or is it just that projects all over completely did not submit projects that had high safety benefits? Because I think TAB is going to ask that, especially if we're looking to maybe as an option having a safety category, because there is a significant reduction to 2024, even though you increased the points.
Yeah, I can answer that question, Molly.
Okay.
The main driver is the money. So we had $100 million more in 2022 than 2024, and that's the big difference. In 2024, even though we did add a lot of points, as you know, to safety, and we funded the highest scoring safety projects across all the categories. So that was, I think, a success. It's just that you got $100 million more pumped into 2022.
Thanks, Steve. All right, we're going to go to Lissa.
Going back to Molly's questions that she pitched, for at least Washington County, and I think generally what I've heard, it's not necessarily about types of projects wanting, you know, additional items like planning studies, for example, funded. To us, it's more of having projects in less dense areas actually compete. It is much more about 80% of our county does not have projects that would compete with the current metrics. That is much more important to us than changing the actual type of project. That's Washington County's perspective, although I think I've heard that quite a bit from a lot of the other counties that do have more rural, lower density areas.
All right, others have thoughts on these discussion questions for today? Be shy, we got 9 minutes left. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, sorry about pushing it. There was a slide that talked about maybe a theme with moving toward a more qualitative analysis, I think. And then I think the second part of that bullet was there's some hesitation. I'm just wondering if Molly can kind of explain that a little bit further.
Yes. So I think traditionally the solicitation has been very quantitative, very data driven, and stakeholders really like that. So there's, you know, data to point to and drive it. And I think as data continues to evolve and develop and become more sophisticated, there's still an interest in that. I think there's been a lot of hesitation on the qualitative side because it's a change. It's a big change of, you know, how do we award points? How do we score in some of the MPOs that we reviewed, they have they don't have as sophisticated as a structure as Met Council has, where it's a scale range of points. It's low, medium, and high, or good, fair, poor type of scoring. And there was just hesitation of just kind of how that would play out. I do think, right now there is some qualitative questions included in the current application structure, so I think there's opportunity probably to continue that going forward. But to go completely towards a qualitative structure versus a question structure in the applications, I don't think there's a lot of support for that right now. But I think still to be determined as we get into that next year with more working through the details of what those actual questions will look like and measures will be. No, Steve, if you had anything to add or.
Oh, that's good. We do have 2 slides on active transportation, Chair Hager, too, that we wanted to touch on if there's no questions.
There's one more hand up right now. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for having your friends at F&P today. Just on this last slide, from Hennepin's perspective, our investment approach is right fix, right location, and right time. So as far as our roadways, I think about 40% of our system's greater than 50 years old. So we're kind of in the reconstruction investment trend. And we really believe that's the right time to consider complete streets, safety countermeasures, kind of everything's on the table, if you will, from what we consider. And then as part of those, we've really seen construction costs go up over the years. And I think I started submitting applications back in 2014. And I seem to recall the roadway maximum was $7 million. And here we are in 2024, and the roadway maximum is still $7 million. So that's probably further along down the road as far as funding levels per category, but definitely not a bad time to put that plug in now as we try to set this program up for success over the next 10 years.
Thanks, Jason. I agree with you. As another agency member with a very old system, I agree with you. Anyone else before we go to active transportation?
Yeah.
All right, Steve,
That'll be
fast. You got 5 minutes.
Yeah, Joe Whiting will come on here. That'll certainly be a 2025 discussion point, but we can't even stop the policymakers from talking about that. So there's lots of interest in like what the maximum award is going to be and what project size is appropriate for federal funds. So yeah, it's forthcoming here, but not till 25. Joe, Whiting, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm
hanging
here.
on?
I'm used to getting squeezed in here, but I'm actually going to take over. I realized that one of our slides need to be updated per our meeting last week. So I have that updated, so I'll just share, and then we'll update the actual materials after the meeting. If I can. Okay. There we go. All right. So just real quick here, I just want to give TAC an update on the active transportation project. So part of the early work of the active transportation committee work group was to figure out if they wanted to add money to their regional solicitation in 2024 for active transportation projects. They decided to do that. You can see here about $19 million for 17 projects in the region. One key note about these is these projects will be managed by us internally at the Met Council. Traditionally, MnDOT state aid manages projects through the regional solicitation, those federal projects. However, the new funding is regionally sourced and allocated by the TAB. So state aid will not manage these projects, so it is on us to do so. Another aspect of this that's key that we were considering through this early process is these are not federally funded projects, so they don't need to necessarily follow the federal requirements for grant recipients. So all these applicants applied for federal funding, but because they got this local funding, we had to think about this a little differently about how to actually manage and administer these projects. So we got to the point where we decided we needed to establish some key requirements for these funds that meet the priorities tab to reduce the administrative burden from the federal funding, to build the management process within the council, and also to have these requirements just be noted that are considered will be specifically for these pilot funds, and they're not necessarily going to be for the permanent program that will be established in 26, but we will be taking lessons from this process to build and to help inform what we do later on. What do those look like? Okay, one second, here we go. And this is the updated slide. So last Thursday, we finished our last discussion point here, but as Elaine noted at the beginning of the meeting, the kind of main items that came up were program year, grant funding disbursements, eligible project costs, project plan documentation and submittal requirements, project scope change process, right-of-way acquisition, environmental review, and then finally the small business contracting program, DBE, MCUB, TGB. They all have different names, but the same idea. So what we landed on, so these will be going to tab it on the 16th. So a couple weeks from now, these will be going for tab's recommendation approval. Program year, we are recommending not to have a program year like the federal projects today. Rather, these projects will be assigned a project number for tracking purposes. They'll be required to identify a project activity period, which will cover that construction period for the project. These will also be required to get before the end of 2026. And how we're defining begin here is if you begin your bidding process for the project. So you don't need to be building the project yet, but you will need to be bidding for the project by the end of 2026. And if you do need an extension beyond that to start your project in say 27, you can get tab approval for an extension. You'll have to go to tab for an approval, but you can do that. On the grant funding disbursements question, we actually are trying a little hybrid kind of experimental approach here to hope that this can maybe ease those upfront construction costs for recipients. So looking to have a 50% of these funds granted upfront at the start of the construction. So that's when you get a construction contract under control, and you can submit that to the council. Get 50% of your grant upfront, and then once you extinguish that 50% of your grant, then the remainder of the 50% will then be reimbursed like a traditional reimbursement process. The idea here again is to get that half that funding up front to get those projects started, get that cash flow moving, and then once you're in that process, then you can be reimbursed later on. Eligible project costs, looking to keep those the same as what are for regional solicitation. So that's just the construction aspect of these projects. Future projects with this funding may be able to do design, planning, right-of-way acquisition, or other ideas, but for this pilot process, we decided to stick with what is eligible under regional solicitation. Project plan documentation and submittals. We'll be looking to have final plans submitted to the council to ensure the project meets minimum standards. Those will be generally the MnDOT facility design guidelines, and also to meet the original project description as applied. So just looking to essentially ensure those minimum standards that get built. Scope change process. The scope change process will also remain the same as the regional solicitations policy. That's a pretty robust and well thought out process, and we'll keep that for now. Right-of-way acquisition. So we'll be looking to follow MnDOT's active transportation program. We won't be requiring a ton of certification, but we will look for applicants to follow applicable state statutes and to submit evidence of ownership or agreement documentation prior to the release of those grant funds. So before the grant funds get released, you'll just need to let us know that you do have control over the right-of-way to actually build the project. Environmental review, again, similar to MnDOT's active transportation program, we won't be requiring any documentation to be submitted, but we'll be requiring any state statutes and permits necessary to be acquired before construction. And finally, this last one that we had not updated yet was a small business contracting program. So the active transportation group met last week, and we'll be recommending to the tab that projects that are selected that we're receiving over $750,000 of grant funding will be required to participate in the MCUB program, which is the Metropolitan Council's underutilized business program, which will work with our Office of Equity and OEEO, sorry, I forgot those two, to review projects for subcontract opportunities and subcontracting goals when appropriate. There's a caveat here. So if any local agencies already have their own process under a program that already exists, so that's Minneapolis, St. Paul, Hennepin County, and I believe Brooklyn Center is also one of them, we will defer to those processes and will not require them in this program. So what this would mean are about 9 entities or about 10 projects will require to work with our Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity to set these goals and work with them to make sure these goals happen. With that said, it's 11:02. I'm 2 minutes over. I tried to go fast, but I was a little over. But so this will be going to tab on the 16th again. So you'll be seeing an action item to go with this and more details at that time as well. So if you want to read up, we will have more information in the next week or so that will have a little more documentation on this. But thanks for sticking with me for an extra couple minutes. Hopefully I got all the information out there and it makes sense. But if not, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call, and we can talk more about this one-on-one. That's it.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Molly. Any questions for either of them before we wrap this presentation up today? Seeing none, any agency reports members want to share today? All right, then that concludes our agenda for today and we stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great